The letter arrived on thick, expensive parchment paper, the kind that felt like a summons. Sarah winced as she slid her finger under the flap. It wasn't just a letter, it was a declaration of war from the front lines of suburban tyranny. "Let me guess," Mark said, not looking up from his laptop. "The lavender is too lavender? The grass is 1/16 of an inch too tall?" Sarah's face was pale. "Worse. Failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. They're fining us $500 for the willow tree." Mark's head snapped up. "The what?" He snatched the letter. There it was, in the cold, bureaucratic language of the Elm Creek Homeowners Association. Their beautiful, decades-old weeping willow, the centerpiece of their backyard and the reason they'd bought the house, was deemed an unapproved foliage obstruction and a threat to property sightlines. They had 30 days to remove it, at their own expense, or face escalating fines. "This is because of Brenda," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with rage. Brenda Higgins, the HOA president. A woman for whom power wasn't a tool, but a cudgel. A month ago, Brenda had casually mentioned over the fence that the willow's leaves were clogging her pool filter. Sarah had politely suggested she get a better filter. This was the response. They fought it, of course. They attended the next HOA meeting, held in the sterile community clubhouse. Brenda sat at the head of the table, a silver-haired queen on a throne of bylaws, flanked by her sycophantic board. She listened to their pleas with a thin, patronizing smile. "The rules are the rules, Mark," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "We can't make exceptions. It sets a precedent. Your individual tree cannot infringe upon the collective beauty of Elm Creek." They saw the fear in the other homeowner's eyes. The man who'd been fined for a non-regulation mailbox. The young family cited for their child's brightly colored tricycle left on the driveway. They were all prisoners of Brenda's whims, hiding behind their perfectly manicured hedges. The tree came down 2 weeks later. The sound of the chainsaws felt like surgery without anesthesia. Sarah cried as the massive limbs crashed down, the green canopy that had dappled their lawn with sunlight now a pile of firewood. Mark stood stiffly, his hands clenched into fists, watching a lifetime of shade and birdsong be reduced to mulch. That night, over a bottle of wine that tasted like ashes, they made a pact. They wouldn't move. They wouldn't scream. They would break her. "She lives for this control," Mark said, a dangerous glint in his eye. He was a tech journalist, a master of research and systems. "But every system has a back door. And she's a bully," Sarah added, her own creative mind, honed from years as a copywriter, beginning to whir. "Bullies have secrets." Their campaign began quietly, a ghost in the machine of Elm Creek. Phase 1. Intelligence. Mark used his skills to dive deep. He found the HOA's financial records, buried in poorly secured community portals. He cross-referenced vendor payments, architectural review approvals, and violation histories. Meanwhile, Sarah became a neighborhood confidant, sharing coffee and sympathies, slowly collecting stories. She learned about Brenda's special relationship with the landscaping company, Green Thumb Inc., which happened to be owned by her brother-in-law. She heard whispers about how certain homes, the ones belonging to Brenda's friends, never seemed to get violations, even with glaring infractions. They discovered the masterpiece of their investigation in a forgotten subclause of the bylaws, Article 14, Section 3, the right of public recitation. A relic from the community's founding, it stated that any homeowner, upon written request, had the right to address the association at a meeting and have any communique they wrote entered into the official meeting minutes, verbatim. It was a dead letter, a piece of legal nonsense. Until now. Phase 2. The setup. They bided their time. They paid their absurd fines for a misaligned garden gnome and a too reflective birdbath. They became model prisoners. Meanwhile, Mark compiled a digital dossier. Spreadsheets showing how Green Thumb's fees were 40% higher than competitors. Timelines proving Brenda's friends got their patio extensions approved in days, while others waited months. It was all cold, hard, irrefutable data. Sarah's weapon was warmer, sharper. She began to write. She didn't write accusations. She wrote stories. Vignettes. She wrote a beautiful, heartbreaking piece about an old man and the heritage oak head planted for his late wife, which was then chopped down for root system violations. She wrote a satirical piece from the perspective of a mailbox, longing for a splash of color. She wrote a poignant story about a little girl who thought the Hoa monster lived in the clubhouse, stealing joy. Each piece was a literary gem, and each one was a scalpel aimed directly at Brenda's hypocrisy. The annual Elm Creek Gala was approaching. A pompous, black-tie fundraiser held at the clubhouse, it was Brenda's night to shine, to play the benevolent leader. It was the perfect stage. They filed their request. They invoked Article 14, Section 3. Brenda, likely thinking they would deliver a rambling, emotional plea, approved it with a condescending smirk. A little public groveling would do them good, she probably thought. The night of the gala arrived. The clubhouse was decked out in gold and white. Brenda held court in a sequined dress, accepting hollow praise. Mark and Sarah arrived, dressed elegantly, their faces calm. They carried nothing but a single, sealed envelope. The moment came. Brenda, at the microphone, announced, "And now, as per our bylaws, we have a recitation from Mark and Sarah Evans." A polite, slightly bored applause rippled through the room. Mark walked to the podium. He didn't look at Brenda. He looked at the crowd, his neighbors. "Thank you, Brenda," he said, his voice clear and calm. He opened the envelope. "Well, be brief. We call this byline. It's a story about our community." He began to read Sarah's first story, the one about the old man and the oak tree. It was beautiful and sad. People shifted uncomfortably. They remembered Mr. Henderson. They remembered the tree. Then, Mark paused. "But a story needs context." He nodded to Sarah, who tapped her phone. On the massive wall-mounted TV usually used for golf tournaments, a slide appeared. It was a payment ledger. "Green Thumb Inc., Mark said. $12,000 for seasonal floral rotation. A job a local nursery quoted at $7,000. A murmur went through the crowd. Sarah's next story began, the satirical mailbox tale. It got a few nervous laughs. Then another slide. A side-by-side comparison of two nearly identical patio extensions. One, belonging to a board member, was approved in 3 days. The other, belonging to the new family on Cypress Lane, was denied for 6 months and ultimately forced to use a more expensive, approved contractor. Mark and Sarah began to trade off. A piece of Sarah's beautiful, cutting prose, followed by a slide of Mark's cold, hard data. The story of the little girl and the monster, followed by a list of every fine levied in the past year. color-coded to show they disproportionately targeted homes not in Brenda's inner circle. It was a symphony of destruction. The beauty of the writing made the corruption feel all the more vile. The crowd was no longer shifting, they were staring, rapt. Anger was replacing embarrassment. They saw the pattern. They saw the machine. Brenda stood frozen, her smile a rictus of horror. This is out of order," she stammered. "Article 14, Section 3, Brenda," Mark said calmly, not even looking at her. Verbatim. He continued reading. They saved the best for last. Sarah's final piece was a masterpiece of irony, a glowing tribute to Brenda Higgins, a leader of impeccable taste and fairness. As Mark read the lavish, false praise, the screen behind him displayed the Peister RSI stance, the original, signed approval form for the willow tree. From when the previous owners had planted it 20 years ago. The signature at the bottom of the approval was unmistakably that of a much younger, but still recognizable, Brenda Higgins. The room fell into a dead, stunned silence. Mark looked up, his eyes finally meeting Brenda's. The power in the room had utterly inverted. She was small, exposed. He was calm, in control. "You cut down our tree for leaves in your pool," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner. "You used our money, our trust, and our community to build your own little kingdom. The story ends now." He and Sarah turned and walked out, leaving a silent, explosive crater in the clubhouse. They didn't go to any more meetings. They didn't have to. The following week, Brenda Higgins and her entire board resigned for personal reasons. A new, temporary board was formed, with Mr. Henderson, the man who'd lost his oak tree, as its interim president. The first thing they did was repeal 17 of the most petty bylaws. The second was to terminate the contract with Green Thumb Inc. One evening, a few months later, Mark and Sarah were sitting on their back porch, looking at the stump of the willow tree. It was still a scar, but the grass around it was green, and the sun was warm. A small sapling, a new oak tree gifted by the neighbors, was growing in a pot nearby, waiting to be planted. "It's not the same," Sarah said, her hand finding Mark's. "No," he agreed, squeezing it. "But it's ours." From down the street, they could hear the sound of a child laughing, and the bright, unapproved flash of a red tricycle gleaming in the sun. They had not just gotten revenge. They had given their neighborhood back its soul.